the fact that certain things bother you. And you might think, I wish nothing bothered me. It's like, no, you don't really, because if nothing bothered you, in some sense, that would be the same thing as not caring about anything. It actually turns out to be the case that the things that bug you are the things that you care about when they go wrong. And so then this is a really useful question to ask yourself, because you might be observing the political landscape and you think, that really bugs me. And maybe you annoy the hell out of your friends and your enemies and even yourself by, being obsessively concerned about that thing that bugs you. And then you might ask yourself, well, why does that bug you? Because there's like a million things that could in principle bother you. And, maybe you're one of those people that has a million things bothering you, but probably not. There's more things that don't bother you than that do bother you, because there's a lot of things. And if everything bothered you, you'd just die. All right, so there's very selective things that bother you, and it's very interesting because in some sense they choose you. Because you might say something like, I wish that didn't bother me. It's like, that's a very strange thing to say, because it begs the question, why then does that bother you? And also, why can't you control it, right? That's a very, this is part of the reason I loved reading the psychoanalysts, because the psychoanalysts knew, they're the first people who really cottoned on to this in a kind of technically sophisticated manner. They knew that we were, in part, collections of autonomous sub-personalities, and that those sub-personalities could take control of us. And that's really what happens when something bugs you. It's something autonomous that has a will and an agency, takes control of you and forces you to attend, despite yourself sometimes. And why should you attend? Because that's your destiny calling you, right? That's your problem. And that's a good thing to know, because people ask themselves, where do I find the meaning in my life? I say, well, are there things that bother you? Yes, those are your problems. And you might say, well, I don't want those to be my problems. Like, hey, did someone ask you? It's just how it happens. And so then why is that relevant to writing? Why don't you write about something that bothers you? And try to figure it out. Because you got to ask yourself, well, first of all, what would your life be like if you actually addressed the things that bothered you, right? Say, well, political things bother me. It's like, maybe you have a political duty that's calling to you. I mean, why not? Someone has to. You're a citizen. Could be you, and not just an interest, right? And not just an obsession, but an obligation and a responsibility. And God only knows what would happen if you pursue that. I was talking to Mike Johnson, who's the fourth most powerful Republican in Washington. About 3 days ago, we were talking about the potential for young people to be involved in the political sphere. In our culture, appallingly, most youth involvement comes in the form of protest, and that's the fault of the idiot universities, as far as I can tell. Because basically what students are taught is that if something bothers them, which it might, then they should protest about it. It's like, well, you could do something about it instead of complaining about the people who are doing something. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. I read in Jung years ago this idea that I found extraordinarily compelling and useful, which was that every ideal is simultaneously and necessarily a judge. And so you imagine that the ideal is something that beckons to you, but you also pale in comparison to the ideal. And so by apprehending an ideal, you're also simultaneously judged, and the higher the ideal, the more intense the judgment in some real sense. I think that's partly why people are terrified of great art, like Michelangelo's David. I read a great commentary on that. The commentator suggested that the statue calls upon you to be far more than you are. So there's that judgment, and I think part of what happens to Moses here is that he's afraid to look upon God, the God of Abraham that calls people to adventure, the God of Isaac the God of Jacob, the God that calls people to adventure and sacrifice and then out of slavery as well, is that ideal that's ultimately terrifying in some real sense. And so Moses hides his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
Moses' reaction to God's call is also one of attention. You know, he says, here I am. That's all he can do. He can just, I'm here and I'm paying attention to what is happening. And this phrase is so important that it's repeated in other places in the Bible. You see it in the story of Samuel, for example, who has that same reaction. He hears the call and all he can say is, I am here and I am attending now. And so it's interesting to see that this idea of attention continues on in the story.
Well, it's this idea of attention is extremely important because it's easy to think of attention and cognition, let's say, or even rationality as somehow equivalent, but they're importantly different because rationality builds towers of Babel, let's say, and rationality makes presumptions about the world, but attention is a precondition for revelation and for rationality, and attention is in and of itself a kind of openness to the horizon of transformation. And the more, I would say, there's a direct connection between being attentive and even being capable of healing in some real sense. So if you're a clinician, one of the things you learn, and Carl Rogers, the clinician, was a particularly potent writer on this notion that attentive listening in and of itself has a curative capacity. You let people unfold in front of you, you encourage them to unfold in front of you. And that's not even analytic thought. There can be a strategic component of it, but mostly it's just the devotion of attention. And attention also, in some real sense, sheds light on the darkness because we only see what we attend to. And what we don't see or what we don't perceive in the broadest sense is in some real sense not even there. So here's something that's really worth considering given what we've been discussing. So imagine you cast a vision onto the unknown to pull yourself forward in faith. Okay, so then the question is, where does the vision come from if it's a proper vision? And I would say the answer to that, neurologically and psychologically, is that it comes from the proper interplay between chaos and order. It really does do that because the order is what you already know and the chaos is what's yet to be learned, right? And there's a meaningful conjunction of those two. And I say meaningful because when those two are conjoined, that's when you get the experience of meaning, like you do when you listen to music, because it's partly predictable and partly unpredictable. And in a conversation that's compelling, it refers to what you know because you can't understand it, but it refers to what you don't know because it wouldn't be interesting. And when those are optimized, then this spirit of meaning that's pulling you forward, and what the spirit of meaning manifests itself in its initial phases from the Jungian perspective is a vision of the potential future. When I explain to the audiences, and this is especially true, seems to be especially true of men, of young men, but not so young even, to say, look, you have an ethical obligation to lift the heaviest load you can possibly conceive of. And that's the primary call to adventure in life. And that call to adventure is so worthwhile that it justifies the particularity. Everybody, it's like light school. They think, I see. So you need a meaning to set against the suffering and to protect you against that temptation towards malevolence. You need that. Well, where's the meaning to be found? Well, it's not happiness. It's not short-term pleasure. It's not self-development. It's not self-esteem. It's none of those things that are so focused on the individual psyche even. It's literally the stumbling uphill towards the city of God with your burden. People go, well, that's where the meaning is, and they know that because they know responsible people. They know they admire responsible people. They already got that. Say, well, that's what you should become, and they think. And not only that, that's what you could become because that's what you are in the deepest sense.